Well, welcome. We're glad to see you here for the second Nights at the Museum performance for the year. I guess I'd call it performance, lecture series. We're so happy that we have such a good crowd tonight. One of the first things I want to mention to you before we get started is if you have a cell phone, as I do, please silence it. We'd like to have you take care of that so we don't have that ringing during Nancy's talk. One of the things that we have to remember, and we should remember all the time, is that before the Dutch came and settled this area, the Native Americans were here. And that we want to remember tonight. Especially, we're glad that Nancy has come to visit with us and talk to us about the importance of the Native Americans in our area. Tonight, Nancy's talk is sponsored by Brad's Breads and Bakery. And Kathy, I think, Kathy Gable is here. You want to stand up, please? Thank you, Kathy. Give you a little background on Nancy. Nancy Gillis is the former executive director of the John Neihardt State Historical Site from March 1997 through July of 2019. She continues presenting to schools and civic groups on Neihardt's work and a variety of related topics such as Native American history, culture, and education. She also served on the faculty of Wayne State College, Northeast Community College, Nebraska Indian Community College, and Little Priest Tribal College from 1990 through 2017, teaching history, anthropology, sociology, and an honors course on Neihardt's life and work. Of Cherokee and Choctaw heritage, Nancy moved to the Winnebago, Nebraska in 1987 to work with the Winnebago people for the Reformed Church in America, and has served as their delegate to its Native American Council. She stays active in various civic organizations, currently or previously serving on the board of the Dr. Susan LaFish Peacoat Hospital Board, State of Nebraska Historical Preservation Office, Nebraska Folklife Network, Atlas of Winnebago, and the Walt Hill Village Planning Commission. I'd like for you to welcome Nancy right now.
Osio, osta sunale negada. Lo nuhi nuato hiadu. Tia zalagi, anewodi. Chinotanahane dagwadoa, also known as Nancy Gillis. I greet you this good day and call on the Creator to be present in blessing us. I am of Cherokee heritage of the Paint Clan, named Chinotanahane, also named Nancy Gillis, and so translated for you. I am also part Choctaw and Muskogee, and the other half of me is Scots-Irish and French, hence the green eyes and the fair complexion. However, my hair was once nearly black. And this is the role of the genetic dice for those of us who are of mixed race. I have, well, I'll explain a little more later about the way my family makeup. I'm very glad to be with you this evening, and I thank Jill for inviting me and members of the board for supporting that. I've brought some books and other items connected to Native women's lives that you're free to look at later, and we'll have time for questions and to visit more. This is the first time I've been in this building, but I'm fairly familiar with Orange City through my years at Winnebago Reformed Church. Some of the items that I've brought, books, some of the books where a lot of my material has come from, and also one of the things I will bring up is how Native women are often perceived by the dominant society, and so I've brought examples of over romanticizing and over sexualizing, and then the pejorative use of a word. And so just to remind us that women's lives were and are still impacted by the changes that have gone on in our cultures and our lives. And so that's what I'm going to address tonight. I've entitled this presentation, The Voices of Native American Women. It's Native Americans Women's Oratory. And I'm going to start with a quote from a Chickasaw author, Linda Hogan, who describes her life by saying, "When I was a child, 2 lives lived me." And this is me also. I was raised primarily by my maternal grandparents and a great-grandmother in a household of combined Cherokee and Choctaw traditions and Western American traditions. Being also of Scots-Irish and French, my first European ancestors arrived here in 1609 in Virginia. They were on the 3rd ship to arrive in the Virginia colony. One of those ancestors had the last name of Van, V-A-N-N, which I think some people with Dutch heritage can also pick up on that. But I was raised very traditional. The language was still spoken at home by my great-grandmother. I know just enough to get me in trouble with my elders, which I'm sure many of you are that way with the Dutch language, you know, just enough. Okay? But was given a very Western education. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, part of the urban Indian population in the San Fernando Valley. And for my grandparents, self-educated, neither one of them went past the 8th grade, and neither of my parents went past the 10th grade. Reading was extremely important to them. So I was taught to read at the age of 4 from the Bible and a set of Collier's encyclopedias. But oral history was also very important. And it's those I try to share with my grandchildren and now my great-grands. And I have friends in the audience, Lowell and Connie Tinclay and Christy. I've known them for years and years. And also my oldest grandson's father-in-law is here, Mike Smith. Many of you know him from the bakery. And so Mike's gonna keep me honest with our heritage here. And he'll tell on me to my family. So I had history and literature from the Los Angeles school system, oral history from my family. And to both I'm grateful because that's how I came to be me. But it's the oral history I remember the most, the lessons which have carried me through some rough times that what I learned elsewhere could not have done. The oral history is the voice of the people themselves, not what's been written about them by outsiders. Most of the recorded oral history is from the great warriors of the past. People are familiar with the words of Seattle and Sitting Bull. But what about the women? In novels and history books, Indian women have been a background element. But primary sources show us that they were not silent and long-suffering, but held a multitude of essential roles in agricultural and medicinal knowledge, economic industry, the education of the children, disposition of property, and the political realm of tribal councils. A little bit of trivia is the fact that the reason they held those roles was that the women in nearly every one of the over 3,000 tribes on this continent owned everything. They owned the garden, they owned the children, they owned all the accoutrements because they made most of this stuff. Most of what you see around you, the women created. And in many of the tribes, a man could not go off to war unless his wife provided him with the food that he could take with him, and if he needed new moccasins, leggings, those kinds of things, because they owned it. Often, they engaged in occupations generally thought of as reserved for men, as warriors, as shamans, and diplomats. And they did so with the men's full support. There were even women chiefs. One of the earliest that we know of is Magnus of the Narragansetts. She was mentioned by name by Captain John Smith in his History of Virginia. And among my own people, the Dialects, or Cherokee, women decided the fate of captives, had the right to wage war themselves, owned all the property, and had equal voice in councils with the men. Cherokee chief Nanahe Ward led her own troops of warriors in the American patriot cause against the British. And many others whose words were recorded, but then forgotten by those who wrote the history books, except for ones like Pocahontas and Sacagawea, who fell into the general categories of princess or squaw, to be romanticized or sexualized, neither of which is complimentary. So what, you might say, that was a long time ago. Well, it falsifies the record of a people who were unable to set it straight, and it reinforced Western patriarchal beliefs that there were no other successful alternate political or economic structures. But it was often the women who led the transitions from the old to the new ways, particularly those women of mixed race, who kept the ancient traditions secreted away so as not to be lost, while at the same time adapting to the changes on the outside. So what I want to share is a collection of quotes from some of these women, past and present, who endured and endure while living within the tribal ethics and traditions. We have since entered every field, from arts to politics, blending traditional values with new competencies. Cherokee author Paula Gunn Allen describes it as the women knit old ways to new circumstances. Now, some of these words were recorded ages ago. They're the words of women long dead. But others will be of today's contemporaries who have been inspired by the traditional lore of the past and yet have come to terms with their present and look to the future. In the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, one of the tenets of that law says, "The chain of culture is the chain of women linking the past with the future." How long does it take before our own Constitution for this nation even mentioned women? So let us hear their voices as they speak out in frustration, in pain, in anger, in determination, and in celebration. For as the Cheyenne proverb states, "A nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground." So the roles of women were not only of gardener, cook, childbearer, and wife. In many tribes, women had a great deal of autonomy. As I said, they owned all the garden and its produce, all the accoutrements of the household. They were decision makers in the lives of children and grandchildren and had great power. And that was especially so among the Iroquois of the eastern Great Lakes and the several tribes of the southeast. In fact, in these groups, it was the elder women who both named and deposed chieftains. These women had real power. I once met, back when the first Earth Day was happening, I was honored to meet Oren Lyons of the Onondaga people. And he mentioned that he had been put in place as one of the chiefs by the elder clan mothers. And he said, and they're the ones that can take me out. And he knew it. He knew it, and he shared that. Back in 1729, a Natchez woman named Stung Arm in Mississippi had reminded her eldest son, who was the Sun Chief, who was conspiring with others against French traders, of the power she had. And this is a quote: "A liar is not even worthy of contempt. Would you even be a Sun Chief if you were not my child? Have you forgotten that?" That's another type of, I brought you into this world, I can take you out. Among the Natchez, These sun mothers had the power of life and death. In fact, when a sun mother died, her husband was strangled at her burial site to accompany her to the afterlife. And they spoke not just in councils, but in negotiations with other tribes and with the growing non-Indian presence. In early 1793, there were delegates from the Northwestern Great Lakes Territory, and they visited George Washington in Philadelphia. Now, many of their speeches were recorded by Thomas Jefferson, who was then Secretary of State. And at that time, Secretary of State was an actual secretary. He took it all down. One delegate was a Wyandot woman who was sent in place of a sachem, or a leader that's both sacred and civic leader, who had died recently, and she addressed the president. "I am a woman, but you must listen, because he was to have spoken to you is now dead. He was my uncle, so it has fallen on me to speak for him. We have come, both men and women, to beseech you to let no one take our lands." And then Bright Eyes, Suzette LaFlèche, Inshtatiamba, of the Omaha tribe of Nebraska. She was a highly articulate woman. Educated in the East, she returned to teach on the Omaha Reservation and eventually became a prominent spokeswoman for her tribe and others, particularly for the Ponca. When, in a landmark Supreme Court case in 1879, she appeared before Justice Elmer Dundee as an interpreter for the Ponca Chief Standing Bear. That trial was the very first challenge to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, and it resulted in the court's decision that an Indian was indeed a person under the law. Now, I won't ask you to quote the 14th Amendment, but it is that one that says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens, and they can't have laws enforced against them without due process of law. This is an excerpt from her words at those court proceedings. "It is a little thing which my people ask of a nation whose watchword is liberty, but it is endless in its consequences. They ask for their liberty, and law is liberty. We did not know of these wrongs, say the magistrates. Is that not only the cry of, 'Am I my brother's keeper?' Now, at last, a man of your race has arisen who has shown faith enough in humanity to arouse the nation from the sin of its indifference." Another facet of women's lives is their affinity for the earth. Native women see it as another woman producing life. And many women's ceremonies deal with recreation, and most are connected directly to sacred sites. So the desecration of those sites, particularly by mining and timbering, are seen as tearing great holes in the mother's breast, leaving it bare. But not only sacred sites have been lost, but other creation held sacred, such as the buffalo of the plains, the salmon of the Pacific Northwest, and the black bear of the Southeast. And the women grieved openly for the loss of the sacred, both in land and nature. An elderly Wintu woman of Northern California lamented the land and chastised civilized white society. And this was in the early 1800s. She said, "When we kill meat, we eat it all. When we dig roots, we make little holes. We don't cut down trees, we use only dead wood. But they plow up the ground, pull down the trees, kill everything, and leave it to rot. And the tree says, 'Don't hurt me.' But they chop it down and cut it up. They blast rocks and scatter them on the ground in their mining, and the rock says, 'Don't, you're hurting me.' They pay no attention. How can the spirit of the earth like them? Everywhere they have touched it, it is sore." From the very beginning, the giving up of large tracts of homeland is one of the greatest conflict issues. When they objected, either as the Creeks, Lakota, and Apache did with armed hostility, or as the Cherokee and Ponca did with lawsuits in American courts, they all fought hard, but eventually lost. That resulted in a long series of forced removals. Removal is a term used for the government forcibly moving entire tribes from their homelands, their farms, their sacred fires, their graves, to alien land bases taken from some other tribe who'd been moved somewhere else, to unfamiliar areas, and often with deadly consequences. Now, most people are aware of the Trail of Tears, traveled by some 18,000 Cherokees in 1836. But the Cherokees weren't the only ones, or even the first. Between 1800 and 1910, nearly every one of the 3,000 tribal groups in North America was removed from their traditional homelands, and often more than once. A Winnebago elder by the name of Felix White Sr., I don't know, did you know Felix, Mike? The first time we met back in '87, he looked me up and down. He says, "What kind of Indian are you?" And I said, "Chalagi Chata." And he said, "Oh yeah, those Trail of Tears people. You know, we Winnebago had our Trail of Tears too. You Cherokee just got better PR." Felix was a wonder. He was Winnebago and Oneida, and he spoke 6 different native languages and a lot of German from when he was in the military. In fact, the Winnebago are the most removed of any of the tribes. They were moved 5 times in the 28 years between 1835 and 1863. Their last move landed them in northeastern Nebraska. Now, out of these removals, there are many stories of families forced to abandon homes and farms, of children separated from parents, and the thousands of deaths along the way. Out of the 18,000 Cherokees who left to move to Oklahoma, nearly 6,000 perished on the way before they ever got to Oklahoma. And times of great tragedy, pain, and loss as refugees in our own country. A Cherokee woman by the name of Rebecca Nugan was a child in 1836 when she began the 6-month journey of 1,000+ miles to Oklahoma Territory. And this is how she related it in her autobiography. When the soldiers came to our house, my father wanted to fight, but Mother told him the soldiers would kill him, so we surrendered. They drove us out of our house to join other prisoners in a stockade. They let Mother bring what she could carry. We had to leave behind everything else we owned. My father had a wagon pulled by 2 span of oxen. 8 of my brothers and sisters, 3 widow women and their children rode with us. My oldest brothers and my father and mother walked all the way. There was much sickness, and a great many children died of whooping cough. And as the winter hit, we were not even allowed to bury our dead, but had to leave them in the snowbanks as we passed. I mentioned the removal areas lasted until 1910. And as late as 1910, the tiny Cupeño tribe, by then numbering not more than 200 people, was removed from its mountainous villages in Southern California. Chelsa Apapas pleaded in protest. She says, "You see that graveyard? There are our fathers and grandfathers. You see that Eagle's Nest Mountain? When God made that place, He gave us this place. We have always been here. We don't want any other place for home. You can kill us, but why not just let us go up into the mountains and die where we belong?" Similar removal policies were repeated in the 1940s and 1950s with the Indian Relocation Act, this time moving individual families into red ghettos in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, and other huge cities. to go from a log and mud Hogan to a slum high-rise, far from the familiar with no skill preparations, led to further disenfranchisement, high unemployment and poverty, and the majority without a vote until 1965. I graduated from high school in 1965, and there were members of my family who had never voted because they had not been allowed to until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Weren't even considered citizens until 1924. And in many of the southern states, Jim Crow laws were in effect until the 1980s. It's with such a painful history, it's no wonder there are cries of righteous anger that often permeate the oratory. Gertrude Bonnen, or Zitgalasha, a Yankton, Dakota woman born in 1876, same year as the Little Bighorn Battle, was Quaker educated. And her writings alternate between controlled rage and a longing to convince white society of Indian humanity. In one of her essays written in 1896, she defends the Indian right to be angry and even to seek vengeance. She says, "What if he fought? His forests were being felled, his game frightened away. He loved his family and would defend them. He loved the land of which he was rightful owner. Do you wonder still that in his breast he should brook revenge when ruthlessly driven from the temples where he worshipped? Do you wonder still that he skulked in forest gloom to avenge the desolation of his home? Is patriotism a virtue only in Saxon hearts?" But inevitably, the change continues: assimilation, adaptation, and acculturation, as well as the past atrocities committed directly on their persons, the women in particular, such as involuntary sterilizations, illegal adoptions of their children, rape, and other violence, many of which continue into today. Much of the pain is still there, and atrocities are still happening. But the strength is also still very present and growing. The women try to understand what has happened and is still happening. Jenny Alika Atya lives on Broughton Island, north of the Arctic Circle. And in an essay she wrote, she reminds us of the dominant society's continuing responsibility for the pains of the past. She says, "The only difference between the Inuit and the white man is the color of the skin, the language, the culture, the values, the outlook on life," and she has this whole list. "The white culture is a strong culture which has been forced on us by missionaries, disease, and today confusion is still forced on us. Your concepts of life, of time, of land are all different. Teaching your way, yes, but going too fast. Making decisions for us, but pretending we are making them. Taking away our children for their own good, our land for our own good, our language, our culture, and our pride for our own good. The white people must protest what their government is doing. If they don't protest, they too will be guilty of destroying us. Then they will write books about us and say, 'What a pity. They have disappeared.' But by then it will be too late." The non-Indian influences are strongly felt even yet on the reservations, because power is often held by an elite few dominated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the churches, and the schools. And throughout the 20th century, the Department of the Interior, which oversees the Bureau of Indian Affairs, continued to decide the best way to handle the clamor for Indian lands and the issues of the health service, education, and welfare, and even individual competency, most without ever setting foot on a reservation, and with no idea of the complexities of those issues. And you add the perspectives changed every 4 years with a new administration. Every president has their own Indian policy. The question of what constitutes competency has been a burning issue. In 1910, a delegation of Omaha which included Dr. Susan LaFlèche Picot, the first Native American physician, not the first female Native American physician, the first Native American physician. The next two, Charles Eastman and Carlos Moctezuma, graduated a year after she did. She went to Washington to confront the Secretary of the Interior over the issue of Indians being deemed incompetent to make their own decisions on the reservations. Now, this was during the period of land allotments, where the reservations were being chopped up into individual parcels of land held by heads of household. She took the stance that the paternalistic attitudes of the government were the primary reason for the Omaha people not getting ahead. She said, his lands are leased for him. His rents are collected for him. His bills are paid for him only if the department approves them. His money is doled out to him like a pension. And when he desires to purchase a horse or a wheelbarrow or a stove, he has to submit his desires to the agency superintendent, who writes for authority to the Indian office in Washington. He'll never get what he wishes to purchase. We are not stones. We have feelings, hopes, aspirations. If we lack initiative, it is because we are being deprived of rightful responsibilities, which we are kept from assuming. We've suffered enough from your experiments. You are robbing us of our rights. As I said at the beginning, education has always been very important to us, but how it's accomplished has had an often brutal history. Some to be abused in boarding schools, a forced separation from family and culture. And that's a history which there's not enough time tonight to explore, but let me share just a couple of instances. Again, Gillis, after college and entering the teaching field herself, she strongly felt the pulls upon her as she watched her own students enduring what she had endured. She says many people visited the Indian school. These Christians were astounded at seeing the children of savage warriors so docile and industrious. Gazing upon the Indian girls and boys bending over their books, the visitors walked out of the schoolhouse well satisfied. They were educating the children of the red man. Afterwards, they could boast of their charity. But few there are who pause to question where a real life or long-lasting death lay beneath this semblance of civilization the children were wearing. Permeating this is a sense that a way of life had been completely stamped out. Realizing that you had no individual agency while the mainstream still remained alien. Now, perhaps early immigrants and slaves felt this way too, but the difference is they either voluntarily left their homeland, knowing they probably would never go back, or were forcibly separated. While Native people are either still on, part of, or near, within sight of homelands, as a constant reminder of what was once theirs and has been lost. Every so often there is a rekindled interest in Native American ideologies, spirituality, philosophies. I often say we get popular again about every 20 years in a cycle. But through much of our history, there's still this theme of extinction, or potential extinction, a vision of no future that became for some a fearsome reality, and for some are still a fearful possibility. There are injuries to the soul which have left scars from generation to generation. The final survival strategy for many has been adaptation and a certain level of acculturation. So the women also spoke about adapting to this dual life that many Native people live. My great-grandmother used to tell me, you will wear 2 dresses. And it took me a while before I understood what she was talking about, but she had worn 2 dresses. And Diane Glancy, who's also Cherokee, is a poet and writer. who speaks of the quandary of living uncomfortably wearing two dresses. She says, there are times you're not white and they look at you as though something were wrong with you. The modern world is difficult. There are taxes, insurances, repairs and maintenance of self and possessions, doctors, dentists, car inspection laws to obey, inoculations, obligations. But often I feel like I'm fighting with a bow and arrow or counting coup while everyone else has a repeating rifle. And again, I heard an echo of my own experiences in the words of Yvonne Monkman, a Canadian Métis. She said, when I was a child, there was no recognition in our schools, no mention of my Indian heritage. Gradually, I did develop a strong sense of who I am, so I want the children under me to know what it means to be Indian today, to live in a society that doesn't fully accept them. People have to learn to question their images and attitudes and to judge each of us as individuals. In sociology, we call this a bicultural bind, highly evident for mixed bloods like myself, and it is an emotional tug of war. I remember in third grade being told by a teacher, you can't be Indian, you don't look Indian. I was fully aware of how different I appeared from even others in my own family. My father had coal-black hair and eyes, and my mother looked Hispanic, and one grandmother was blonde and blue-eyed. My half-siblings ranged from olive complexion and straight brown hair to fair with wavy black hair. Or to be told you can't be Indian, there are no Indians left. And I went home to a whole house full of them. So, and often there's a special stigma reserved for those of mixed racial heritage, whether it's Indian and white, African American and white, Asian and white. And even in Indian communities for mixed tribal heritage. Now, I've been accepted in the Winnebago and Omaha communities because I'm from a completely different tribe. If I was Ho-Chunk and Lakota, say, I probably would not have been accepted as readily. There are those kinds of stigmas also reserved. And for me, it's either been she's Indian, so she'll understand, or she's Indian, she ought to know better. You can't win. And when asked, sometimes I used to go do a lot of speaking. I speak a lot for Nebraska Humanities, but also I did for the RCA. I would go to the East Coast or out to Bellingham, Washington, and so forth to speak on behalf of the RCA with the Winnebagos. And I would sometimes get, what's it like to be Indian? Well, that's a rude question, but you can't tell somebody, well, you're just being rude. My first impulse would be to ask back, well, what's it like to be human? There's this sense of the exotic sometimes that it's hard to get past. So, but those who ask those kinds of questions want to hear differences. They want to believe the romantic stereotypes. They want to hear about Cherokee princess grandmothers and Mother Earth spirituality, not how my mother chose high heels over moccasins. When my grandmother said, you will wear two dresses, I knew this also meant that I would have to balance in two worlds. When my hair was darker and when I sported quite a tan, but after 2 bouts with cancer, I don't get out in the sun much anymore. It was a little more difficult. Now people automatically assume I'm completely Anglo, and of course I apprise them of the difference, and I try to be gentle about it because sometimes that has to be done after they've asked a really stupid question. I had a professor that says, there is no such thing as a stupid question, and a student in the back raised their hand and said something. He said, now that was a stupid question. So what we do, I know this has been a heavy presentation, but so we ask for recognition of our cultures, but more importantly, for our humanity. We are not exotics. Native people struggle at all social levels to be recognized as active subjects, not passive objects, in the ongoing history of this country. We don't need to be referenced in the past tense. Indians believed this, Indians did that, Indians lived this way. I mean, we're surrounded by the past tense, especially women. Whether in the image of the squaw to be victimized or the princess to be romanticized, finding ourselves identifying with two hopelessly conflicting definitions, both of which prevent Native women from being taken seriously. But my contemporaries, like Cherokee Principal Chief Wilma Mankiller, who we lost a few years ago, a remarkable woman, and Menominee Chair Ada Deer, authors like Louise Erdrich, activists like Lakota Mary Bravebird, Nebraska State Indian Commissioner Judy Gashgabas, Santee Gaming Manager Thelma Thomas, and the newly appointed U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. We continually battle with our own flesh and blood, those images of Sacagawea and Pocahontas, for recognition, for validity. So in closing, we hear the women speak to the present in honesty and to the future in hope. Again from Paula Gunn Allen. So the past 500 years testify to our skill at waging this struggle for the survival of our children, our people, our value systems, and our ways of life. For all the varied weapons of extinction pointed at our heads, we have endured. We survive, we bond, we fight, we teach, we nurse, we earn, we laugh, we hang in there no matter what. Of course, some, many of us, just give up. Many are alcoholics, addicts, have abandoned their children, their old ones, or commit suicide, become violent, go insane. But enough hold on to their traditions so that even after almost 500 brutal years, we endure. Yes, the statistics, the facts of poverty, racism, sexism, even fighting for our missing and exploited children, and justice for our missing and murdered sisters, my own mother included, make it extremely difficult. But the Native woman today must somehow project a clearer identity without having to spend so much time explaining ourselves to the dominant culture. Not only Native Indian women, but all women need a definition apart from the images. Otherwise, we will continue to be disenfranchised and our voices will be lost. Will that be allowed to happen? Are the hearts of the women on the ground? I think not. We celebrate the possibilities of the future. I'll end with Mary Bravebird, a Lakota activist, author, participant in the 1973 standoff at Wounded Knee, who is still a Sundancer, a mother and a grandmother, and she gives us hope. She said, "Together with my sisters from many tribes, I still am a birth giver, a rebirth giver, fighting to ensure a life for the unborn generations." Wado. Thank you. Are there any questions? I'd be happy to answer if I can. Yes, sir.
Quick observation, then a question. I went to a college that was surrounded on three sides by Indian reservations, and it was during the 80 protests. Mm-hmm. And I recall that some Indians were referred to as apples.
Yes. Every racial group has that, either an apple or an Oreo or a banana. An apple is a Native person that is seen as being red on the outside, having Indian skin, but really being a white person on the inside. Otherwise, they've become so acculturated that they're no longer really an Indian. For the African American society, it's an Oreo, someone who's got black skin but is really a white person on the inside. So those are pejoratives within the culture itself.
So my question is, I remember reading or hearing that there were a number of Indian tribes that had not been recognized by the American government.
Federal government, yes, right.
Is that going to change, do you think?
There are 560 some, 580 some federally recognized tribes. There over 1,000 that are state recognized, I mean by the state that they're in, and then those that are not recognized by the government but who still exist. California is a case in point where you have what are called tribelets. Tribelets. They've got 200 or fewer members in their tribe, and their land is called a rancheria. And actually, California has more Native Americans there than any place else in the country. They have the highest Native American population, but people never think of California as being Indian country. The largest tribe, population-wise, is the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. The Cherokee principal chief is kind of like a governor of a small state, about 290,000 Cherokees. The next largest is the Navajo or Diné people of the Four Corners area, and they're at about 250,000. But there's over 3.7 million natives in the United States. And that doesn't count Canada, of course. So, yes, sir.
I read someplace where someone was getting all the dialects and different languages in the world, and I know there are different languages, and has anybody ever tried to record the different dialects of the Indian tribes?
Well,
because there has
yeah.
to be a lot.
Yeah, we over 3,000 tribes on first contact, speaking over 300 different languages, and then there's dialects within those. Some of them are just linguistic nuances, like the Eastern Band of Cherokee in the Carolinas and the Western Nation in Oklahoma can talk to each other, but the pronunciation's a little different. Same way with the difference between Lakota and Dakota. I was taught that if a Lakota man is fond of you, he says, "I love you." If a Dakota man is fond of you, he says, "I dove you." It's those kind of just slight linguistic differences. But there's one thing to remember about native languages, and a lot of the tribes have these language renaissance programs to where they're beginning to...
It'd be a crying shame to see any of it die.
Yeah, because, well, during the boarding school era, the children were forced to not speak their native language. And so we have 2 whole generations who do not speak their language. My mother didn't. My grandfather spoke just enough to where when his mother would speak to him in Cherokee, he would answer her in English. He understood her, but he couldn't converse with her. And I'm the next one in the family to try to learn the language, but I'm not exposed to it much. But one thing to remember about these languages, if you want to learn Dutch, you can go to the Netherlands, right? And you can be immersed in it. If the language is lost here in the United States, you can go somewhere. You can go to Germany, you can go to Belgium, you can go to France and learn your mother tongue. If the native languages are lost here, they're gone. They're extinct because they're nowhere else. And so it's very important. A lot of bad things happened in boarding schools, but a lot of good things did too. My adopted Lakota brother had a wonderful history at Red Cloud Indian School, which used to be Holy Rosary Mission in Pine Ridge. The Jesuits have a long history of preserving the language. They wanted to learn it from the very beginning. They learned it, translated the Gospels into the language, and created a written language for it because it was all oral. The Cherokee were the only people that had a written language of their own, and that wasn't until 1827. It was created by them. But yeah, the language is very important because there's more to the language than you think. There's so much of the culture and the spirituality embedded in the language. Even in our names, but 2 years ago, Michael is my grandson's father-in-law, and so my grandson's children were named and given Winnebago names and feathered in a ceremony. And those are their secret names that they will carry the rest of their lives. My own name translates as left behind. But that's not that I've been abandoned. If you think of a time, and I'll try to make this real short because it can be very convoluted, a time when humans and animals and the veil of the spiritual world and this world you were able to kind of pass back and forth between. And if someone was leaving their home and their family for whatever reason, they would call on this power to protect. And that power was seen as an entity that could shapeshift. It could be invisible, or it could take the shape of what we call in the South a painter, a panther, or any number of animals, or it could become invisible, and it could make everything around it invisible. So this thing that was brought to protect while the head of household was gone, that's my name. Okay, so without that, being able to interpret that in the language, a Cherokee speaker can look at the way my name is written, or I can pronounce it for them, and they know that. And there's a whole part of the culture that's wrapped up in that would completely disappear. One of my favorites is the Lakota warrior, young man afraid of horses. And that name gets laughed at. But what his name actually means is he's such a fierce warrior that the enemy has to be afraid even of his horses. So there's so much of the culture tied up in the language. If we lose it, we're gone. Yeah. I don't know, Jill, how are we doing on time? Got time for another couple of questions?
Yeah.
Okay, anybody? Yes, sir.
The first part of your talk, I was struck by the passage of values through oral from generation to another. And with the diversity that is the Native American culture, it would seem to me that preserving that somehow through, for example, the Library of Congress has a way to preserve oral tradition. I guess my question is, has there been any effort to try to capture that?
Yeah. Early on, the Edison wax cylinders, they're actually Omaha songs and stories in the Omaha language on wax cylinders. So in the 1800s, they were beginning to capture some of this, thinking that it was going to disappear. And then these language renaissance programs and the cultural programs were desperately trying to hold on to those. And some tribes have not become as acculturated as others. Like among the Hopi and the Zuni and the Dene, the Navajo, they're still closer to the traditional cultures than some of our other tribes are. But yeah, and having Deb Holland on our side is going to be very helpful. The Smithsonian was originally founded just to be a repository of stuff and not to have an educational branch. But in about the last 50 years, they have developed an educational branch. And so they're actively working with tribes, especially with the new Native American History Museum in DC. They're trying to not only just collect items, but know the story behind them, how they were used, why they were used, how they were created, what went into it, and so forth. So there's hope. There's hope. There's always hope.
One other thing. At one time, I understand that they figured there was like 20 million buffalo in the Great Plains. Did they ever find out who ordered all those buffalo robes? Because there wasn't 20 million people here at that time.
Now, one of the main uses of the hides, and one of the reasons that Cody and others were sent out on these huge buffalo hunts, one was to feed the railroad workers as the Transcontinental Railroad was being brought. We went down to less than 200 bison left alive by 1900.
Yeah.
And but the Industrial Revolution on the East Coast, all of those machines needed pulley belts. Cowhide is not dense enough for those pulley belts, and this was before the type of rubber and so forth that we can use now. So buffalo hide was used for industrial belts. And that was one of the biggest uses.
That's good. I'm learning something all the time.
And then the bones were collected and used for fertilizer. If anybody here grows roses, bone meal is one of the best foods. And so, and a lot of this part of the country, the prairie wasn't meant to be farmed. And especially in the southern plains, definitely not meant to be farmed. And so the land had to be nurtured all the time with fertilizers. And so a lot of those bison went into bone meal too. So one more. No? Oh, over here.
Explain the relationship of the name Ho-Chunk to Winnebago.
Okay. Quick history lesson. On one side of Lake Michigan were the Huron people, on the east side. On the west side of Lake Michigan, at what is now Green Bay, Wisconsin, was another people called the Ho-Chunka. And their name meant the people of the parent speech, the people who, every time they opened their mouth, they praised the Creator. That's the Ho-Chunka. Okay. When the French fur traders came in contact with the Huron, they said, who's on the other side of this big body of water we might want to trade with them? And the Hurons said, Winnebago, people who live by the stinking water. That's how Green Bay got its name, is because it stinks, okay, right? In the summertime, the green is an algae bloom. And so the people who live by the stinking water, okay? So the French bring that name with them when they make contact with the Ho-Chunka people, and they call them Winnebago. Well, the Winnebagos don't know that that's what the Hurons call them. So they pick it up. It's like with the name Sioux. There's no such thing as a Sioux. There's an Algonquian word, Metawisu, which means little snakes. Our enemies. And so that name was carried by the French across in contact. I mean, if somebody came up to you from a different language and says, well, we call you Hottentots, you might say, oh, we're Hottentots. Okay. And so that gets carried on. But the Winnebagos of Nebraska use mainly Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. And then for business, we'll use like Ho-Chunk Incorporated and so forth. The portion of the tribe that's in Wisconsin still, consider that they call themselves the Ho-Chunk of Wisconsin. So they're the same people, the same tribe, but they have two tribal governments. They're completely autonomous of each other. They each have their own treaties with the U.S. government. It's like with the Cherokee on the East Coast and the Cherokee in Oklahoma. So, that answer your question? Did I get that right, Mike? Yeah. Okay. I'm his elder. He can't say that I'm wrong. Okay. Well, I'm going to say thank you to you in my own language, which is Wado. But to listen to how different the languages are, I'm going to teach you how to say thank you in a couple of the other languages. Among the Ho-Chunk, or the Winnebago people, it would be Pinagigi. Pinagigi. Okay, Pinagigi. Among our Lakota neighbors is Padamiaye. Padamiaye. Or you can just say Washte, which means good. It's good. Among the Omaha people, it's Wiblaha. And you got to get that H up in here. Wiblaha. Wiblaha. Okay. So thank you so much for having me here this evening, and I'll be around for a little while. If anybody has any questions, come up and look at things.
Is that your language too?
No, Navajo Yata'e is the kind of general greeting and saying goodbye, kind of like aloha, works both ways. For the Cherokee, you greet someone with saying Otsio. Otsio. And so for the Navajo, it's Yata'e. Yata'e.
Well, I'd like to thank Nancy for being here again. We've learned so much, and I really appreciate her coming. So thank you. I want to just offer a short reminder. August 17th is our next Nights at the Museum. Sarah Heuser and Dr. Rebecca Korseman will be making a presentation. And Sarah, what's the title of it?
Oh, golly, that's a good question. Well-behaved women seldom make history, but they should.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that will tie in well with what we had tonight.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you very much for coming, and also thank you for all the support you've given to the museum. So good night.